GeekWares. It's me again, Sean. I am back with Chapter 2, Part 2, next section of Lord of the Rings. It is ironically Chapter 2, but we're going to see how far we can whisper. I can't whisper as long as Shannon can, because I haven't been doing it as long, so we'll see how far we make it, and we'll definitely go from there. So anyways, we are on Chapter 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring, titled The Shadows of the Past. The talk did not die down 9 or even 99 days. The second disappearance of Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton, and indeed all over the Shire, for over a year and a day. So, for those that have watched the movies but never read the books, there's going to be a lot of things that obviously they couldn't cram into the movies, like being an entire year break between Bilbo leaving and, the whole events of the Fellowship Ring starting off, with Gandalf having to move Frodo out of the Shire and the ring race and all of that. There's large gaps in this book. In the entire series, the movies make it seem like the whole thing happens in like 6 months, but it's really years over time that this actually happens. So, anyways, just a weird tidbit. So, while you may think you know the journey, there are a lot of things that are in the book, obviously, that are not the movies, which, even though the movies are 2 to 3 hours long a piece, it's still hard to cram all of that into 3 movies. So, just a fun little warning for you. So even if you have seen the movies, this may be a fun journey for you, because while the books are pretty close, it's not quite exact. Anyways, the second disappearance of Mr. Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton, and indeed all over the Shire, for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits, and especially Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend and live on long after the true events were forgotten. But in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had at long last gone quite mad, and had run off into the blue. There he had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river, and came to a tragic, but hardly an untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf. If only that dreaded wizard will leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense, they said. And to all appearance, the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down, but the growth of hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddness. He refused to go into mourning, and the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 112th birthday, which he called 100-Weight Feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals, at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits said. Many people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up the custom of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead. When they asked, "Where is he then?" he just merely would shrug his shoulders. He lived alone, as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly descendants of Old Took, who had as children been fond of Bilbo, and often in and out of Bag End. Falco Buffin and Frederick Polger were 2 of those, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck. His real name was Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping all over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folk, he was sometimes seen far from home, walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Pippin suspected that he visited the elves at times, just as Bilbo had done. As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens. Some folk have all the luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 that they began to think it odd. Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years he was quite happy and did not worry too much about the future, but half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing. He found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wildlands and the strange visions of mountains that he had never seen come into his dreams. He began to say to himself, "Perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day," to which the other half of his mind always replied, "Not yet." So it went on until his 40s were running out and his 50th birthday was drawing near. 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant or ominous. It was, at any rate, at that age, the adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield, and more often by himself. And Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with strange wayfarers that began at this time to appear in the Shire. There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at the time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news that he could. Elves who seldom walked in the Shire could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing but not returning. They were leaving Middle-earth, and they were no longer concerned with its troubles. They were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end on the Grey Havens, and the dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts. If they wanted, or the hobbits. Oh wait, hold on. If they wanted any, as a rule, dwarves said little, and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and of the land of Mordor. That name hobbits only knew in the legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories. It was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to appear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said, but from there the power was spreading far and wide, and far east and south. There were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons, and there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all of these, but they simply had no name. Little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, but even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear the odd tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. A conversation at the Green Dragon by Bywater one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year showed that even in the comfortable heart of the Shire, rumors had been heard, but most hobbits still laughed at him. Sam Gamgee was sitting in one corner near the fire. Opposite him was Ted Sandyman and the miller's sons. There were various other rustic hobbits listening to their talk. "Odd things you do hear these days, to be sure," said Sam. "Aye," said Ted. "You do if you listen, but I can't hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to." No doubt you can," retorted Sam, "and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories, anyway? Take dragons, now." "Thank ye," said Ted, "but I won't. I heard of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's Crane," he said, getting a general laugh. All right, said Sam, laughing with the rest. "But what about these three men? These, giants, as you might call them. They do say that one was bigger than a tree, was seen way up beyond the North Moors not long back." "Who's they?" "Well, me cousin Hal, for one. He works for Mr. Buffin at Overhill and goes up to the North Farthing for the hunting. He saw one. Says he did, perhaps." "Talk!"
I would have just let that go.
"Says he did, perhaps. Hal's always saying he's seen things, and maybe he sees them even when they aren't there. But this one was as big as an elm tree, and walking 7 yards to a stride, as if it were nothing more than an inch. Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree, as not. But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on North Mowers." "Then Hal can't have seen one," said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping, the audience to think that Ted had scored a point. "All the same," said Sam, "you can't deny the others besides our Hellfast has seen some odd folk crossing the Shire. Crossing it, mind you. There are more than have turned back at the borders, and the Bounders have never been so busy. And I've heard all that elves are moving west. They do say they are going to the harbors out away beyond the White Towers." Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers, beyond the western borders of the Shire. But it was an old tradition that over there stood the Grey Havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. "They are sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us," said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly, but Ted simply laughed at him. "Well, that isn't anything new, if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail, but I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire." "Well, I don't know," said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and still hoped to see more one day. Of all the legend that he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales and half-remembered stories about the elves as the hobbits knew had always moved him most deeply. There are some even in these parts, as I know the fair folk get news of them. There's Mr. Baggins now, too, that I work for. He told me they were sailing and he knows a bit about elves, and old Mr. Bilbo knew more. Many's the talk I had with him when I was just a lad." "Oh, they're both crazy," said Ted. "Leastways, old Bilbo was completely cracked. And Frodo is cracking. If that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friends, I'm off home to your good health." He drained his mug and went out noisily. Sam sat silent and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do in the back end garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow. If the weather cleared, the grass was growing fast, but Sam had more on his mind than gardening. After a while, he sighed, he got up, and he went out. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after a heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into the night. He walked home under the early stars through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party, he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit. After taking a good look at him, he was off again. During the next year or two, he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk and going off without a warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly, his visits had ceased. It had been over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard from him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in the hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. "Well, you look the same as ever, Frodo." "And so do you," Frodo said. But secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. He pressed him for news of himself and the wide world, and they were soon deep in talk and stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had ran at a bag end without a handkerchief. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been then, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom, but his eyes as bright as ever. He smoked and blew smoke rings with the same vigor and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning, he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence. "Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf. But then you stopped because you said such matters were best left until daylight. Don't you think you better finish now? You say the ring is dangerous, far more dangerous than I guess. But in what way?" "In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I even dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess them. In Aragorn, long ago, many elven rings were made. Magic rings, as you would call them. And there were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown. To the elven smiths, they were but trifles, yet still, to my mind, dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. Immortal Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, does not grow, or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes, in the end, invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the ring. Yes, sooner or later, if he's strong-willed and well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later, the dark power will consume him. How terrifying, said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sound of Sam cutting the lawn came in from the garden. How long have you known of this? Asked Frodo after a length of time. And how much did Bilbo know? Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure. He would have never certainly passed it on to you, anything that he thought would be a danger, even if I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was simply beautiful and useful in need, and if anything was wrong or odd, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and he was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the thing needed looking after, it did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way. It might suddenly slip off a finger when it had been simply tight before, when it had been tight moments before. Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter, so I have always kept it safe on its chain. Very wise, said Gandalf. But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit of that to himself, and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, I believe, were his words. A sign that the ring was gaining control. How long have you known all this? Known, said Gandalf. I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo. If you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There's a last test to make, but I no longer doubt my guess. When did I first begin to guess? He mused, searching back in memory. Let me see. It was the year that the White Council drove back the dark power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of Five Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered how Gollum came by the great ring as plainly as it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I simply couldn't believe it. When I at last got the truth of him, I saw at once he'd been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt. Much like Gollum, it was his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it and soon got angry. There was little else I could do. I could not take it from him, not without doing even greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyways. watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the Wise, but something always held me back. "Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I've never heard of him before." "Maybe not," answered Gandalf. "Hobbits are and were of no concern of his. Yet he is among the wise. He is the chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is vast, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven Rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fears, so my doubt slept but uneasily. Still, I watched and I waited. All seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed, and yes, they passed, and passed, and passed, yet he seemed untouched by them. He showed no signs of age. His shadow fell on me again, but I said to myself, after all, he comes of a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Just wait. And I waited until that night he left his house. He said and did things that filled me with a fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of my years since then trying to find the truth of it. There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there? Asked Frodo anxiously. He would, be alright in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean. He felt better at once, said Gandalf. But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about the hobbits. Among the wise, I'm the only one that goes for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter as they can be, and sometimes tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need to worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years, and used it so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off, but it was safe for him to see again. For instance, otherwise he might live on for years, quite happily. Just stop as he was when he parted with it. For he gave it up in the end of his own accord. An important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo anymore. Once he had let the thing go, it was for you that I feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire. If all your kind, jolly, stupid bulgars, hornblowers, boffins, bracegirdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginsons, became enslaved. Frodo shuddered. But why should we be? He asked. And why would he want such slaves? To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits. You should be thankful, but your safety is past. He does not need you. He needs more useful servants, but he won't forget you again, and the hobbits, as miserable slaves, would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is such a thing as malice and revenge. Revenge, said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo and myself and our ring. It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf. You don't know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I was last here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It suddenly felt very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It was made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo. There are none. It is quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or sign of wear. Well then look. To Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle of the glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up and closed the shutters outside the window and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sham's shears, now near the windows, could still be heard faintly from the garden. For a moment, the wizard stood looking at the fire. He then stooped and removed the ring from the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo grasped. It's quite cool. Just take it. Frodo received it on his shrinking palm. It seemed to become thicker and heavier than ever. Hold it up and look closely. As Frodo did so, he saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the outside and inside of the ring. Lines of fire that seemed to form letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright and remote, as if in a great depth. That's what it says. That's what appears on the ring. I'm gonna edit that in. I cannot read the fiery letters, Frodo said in a quavering voice. No, but I can. The language is Elvish, even if it is a very ancient one. Or the letters are Elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this, in the common tongue, is what is said. One ring to bring them all, and in darkness bind them. It is only 2 lines of verse, long known in elven lore. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where shadows lie. He paused, and slowly, in a deep voice, this is the Master Ring. The one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago, after a great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out. A vast hand, like a dark cloud, rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. This ring... How on earth did it come to me? But that is a very, very long story. The beginnings lie back in the black years, which which only the lore masters now remember. If I were to tell you that tale, we would be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron, the Dark Lord. The rumors that you have heard are true. He has indeed risen again, and left his hold in Mirkwood and returned to his ancient fastness in the Dark Tower of Mordor. That name even you Havlets have heard of, like a shadow on the border of old stories. Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and simply grows again. I wish it not to have happened in my time, said Frodo. As do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. He shall be hard put to it. We shall be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks one thing to give him the strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, to break down the last defenses, and to cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring, the three fairest of us all. The elf lords hid from him, and his hand never touched him or sullied him. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One and became ring-wraiths, shadows under his great shadow, his most terrible servants. Long ago, it is many a year since the 9 have walked abroad. Yet, who knows, as the shadow grows once more, they too may walk again. But come, we will not speak of such things, even in the morning of the Shire. So it is now the 9 has gathered to himself the 7 also, or else they are destroyed, and the 3 are hidden. But this no longer troubles him, for he only needs the 1, for he made that ring himself. It is his, and he let a great part of his former power pass into it, so that he could rule all others. If he recovers it, then he will command them all again, wherever they be, even the 3. All that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever. And that is a dreadful thing, Frodo. He believed that the One had perished, and the elves had destroyed it, as should have been done, but he knows now that it has not been destroyed, but has been found. So he is seeking it, and all his thought is bent on it, and his great hope and our great fear. Why wasn't it destroyed? And how did the enemy ever come to lose it? Cried Frodo. If he is so strong, and it was so precious to him. He clutched the ring in his hand, as if he saw already dark fingers stretching out to seize it. It was taken from him. The strength of the elves to resist him was greater long ago, and not all men were estranged from them. The men of Westernese came to their aid. That is a chapter of ancient history, which it might be good to recall. For there was a sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valor, the great deeds that were not wholly vain. One day, perhaps, I will tell you the tale, or you shall hear it told by someone who knows it best. But for the moment, since all you need to know is how this thing came to you, and that will be tale enough, this is all I will say. It was Gil-galad, Elven King, and Elendil of Westernese who overthrew Sauron, though they themselves perished in the deed, and Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand and took it for his own. Then Sauron was vanquished, and his spirit fled, was hidden for long years, until his shadow took shape again in Mirkwood. But the ring was lost. It fell into the great river Anduin and vanished. For Isildur was marching north along the east banks of the river, and near the Gladden fields where he was waylaid by the orcs of the mountains, and almost all of his kin were slain. He leaped into the waters, but the ring slipped from his finger as he swam. The orcs saw him and shot him down with arrows. Gandalf paused, and there were dark pools amid the Gladden fields. The ring passed out knowledge and legend, and even so much of its history is known now only to a few. The Council of the Wise could discover no more. But at last I can carry on the story, I think. Long after, but still very long ago, there lived by the banks of a great river on the edge of a clever-handed and quiet-footed little people. I guess they were of hobbit kind, akin to the fathers of the stores, for they loved the river and often swam in it or made little boats of reeds. There among them a family of high repute, for it was large and wealthier than most, and it was ruled by a grandmother that was stern and wise in her old lore, such as they had. The most inquisitive and curious mind of the family was called Sméagol. He was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools and he burrowed around trees growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds. He ceased to look up at the tree hills, or the leaves on the trees, or the flowers opening in the air. His head and his eyes were downward. He had a friend called Daigle, of similar sort, sharper-eyed, but not too quick or strong. One a time, they took a boat and went down to the Gladden fields, where there were great beds of iris and flowering seeds. There Sméagol got out and went nosing about in the banks, but Daigle sat in the boat and fished. Suddenly, a great fish took his hook. Before he knew where he was dragged out and down into the water to the bottom. Then he let go of his line, for he thought there was something shining in the riverbed. Holding his breath, he grabbed at it. He came up sputtering with weeds in his hair and a handful of mud, and he swam to the bank. And behold, when he washed the mud away, there in his hand lay the most beautiful golden ring, and it shone and glinted in the sun, so that his heart was glad. But Sméagol had been watching him from behind a tree, and as Daigle gloated over the ring, Sméagol came up softly behind. "Give us that, Daigle, my love," said Sméagol over his friend's shoulder. "Why?" said Daigle. "Because it's my birthday, my love, and I wants it," said Sméagol. "I don't care," said Daigle. "I have given you a present already, more than I can afford. I found this, and I am keeping it." "Oh, you are indeed, my love," said Sméagol. He caught Daigle by the throat and strangled him to death there on the banks, because the gold looked so bright and beautiful. He then put the ring on his finger. No one ever found out what had become of Daigle. He was murdered far from home, and his body was cunningly hidden. But Sméagol returned alone, and he found that none of his family could see him when he was wearing the ring. He was very pleased with this discovery, and he concealed it, and he often used it to find out secrets and to put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses. He became sharp-eyed and keen-eared for all that was hurtful. The ring had given him power according to his stature. It is not to be wondered that he became very unpopular and was shunned by all of his relations. They kicked him, and he bit their feet. He took to thieving and going around muttering to himself and gurgling in the throat. So they came to call him Gollum, and cursed him, and told him to go far away. His grandmother, desiring peace, expelled him from the family and turned him out of their hole. He wandered in loneliness, weeping little for the heartless world, and he journeyed up the river until he came to a stream that flowed down from the mountains, and he went that way. He caught a fish in the deep pools with invisible fingers and ate them raw. One day, it was very hot, and as he was bending over the pool, he felt a burning on the back of his head. A dazzling light from the water pained his wet eyes. He wondered at it, for he had almost forgotten about the sun. Then, for the last time, he looked up and shook his fist at it. Shook his fist, not shaked. That's not even a word. But, as he lowered his eyes, he saw far above the tops of the misty mountains, out of which the stream came, and he thought suddenly it would be cool and shady under those mountains. The sun could not watch me there. The roots of these mountains must be the roots indeed. There must be great secrets buried there, which have not been discovered since the beginning. So he journeyed by night up to the highlands, and he found a little cave out of which the dark steam ran, and he wormed his way like a maggot into the heart of the hills and vanished out of all knowledge. The ring went into the shadows with him, and even the Maker, when his power had begun to grow, could learn nothing of it. Gollum, cried Frodo. Gollum? Do you mean that this is the very Gollum creature that Bilbo met? How loathsome. I think it is a sad story. It might have happened to others, even to some hobbits that I have known. I can't believe that Gollum was connected with hobbits, however distantly, said Frodo with some heat. What an abominable notion. It is true, but all the same, replied Gandalf. Their origins. At any rate, I know more than hobbits do about themselves, and even Bilbo's story suggests the kinship. There is a great deal in the background of their minds and memories that is very similar. They understood one another remarkably well, very much better than a hobbit would understand, say, a dwarf, or an elk, a orc, or even an elf. Think of the riddles they both knew, for one thing. Yes, though other folks beside hobbits ask riddles, and of much the same sort. Hobbits don't cheat. Gollum meant to cheat all the time. He was just trying to put poor Bilbo off his guard, and I dare say it amused his wickedness to start a game which might end in providing him an easy victim. But if he lost, you would not hurt him. Only too true, I fear. But there is something else in it, I think, which you do not see. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than even one of the wise could have guessed, as a hobbit might. There was a little corner in his mind that was still his own, and light came through it, as though a chink in the dark. Light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of winds and trees and sun on the grass, and such many forgotten things. Okay, pick it up later. Gollum, do you mean that this is the very golem creature that Bilbo met? How loathsome. I think it is a sad story, and it might have happened to others, even to some hobbits that I have known, said the wizard. I can't believe that Gollum was connected with hobbits, however distantly, said Frodo with some heat. What an abominable notion. It is true, all the same, said Gandalf, about their origins at any rate. I know more about hobbits than they do themselves, and even Bilbo's story suggests the kinship. There is a great deal in the background of their minds and memories that are very similar. They understood one another remarkably well, very much better than a hobbit would say a dwarf, an orc, or even an elf. Think of the riddles they both know, for one thing. Yes, said Frodo, though other folks besides hobbits ask riddles, and of much the same sort, and hobbits don't cheat. Gollum meant to cheat all the time. He was trying to put poor Bilbo off his guard, and I dare say it amused his wickedness to start a game which might end in providing him with an easy victim, but if he lost, would not hurt him. Only too true, I fear, said Gandalf, but there was something in it, I think, that you don't see yet. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than even one of the wise would have guessed. A hobbit might. There was a little corner in his mind that was still his own, and light shone through it. There was a chink in the darkness, light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memory of winds and trees, suns on the grass, and long-forgotten things. But that, of course, would only make the evil part of him angrier in the end, unless it could be conquered, unless it could be cured, Gandalf sighed. Alas, there is little hope of him for that. Yet, not no hope. No, not though he possessed the ring for so long, almost as far back as he can remember, for it was long since he had worn it that much. In the black darkness, it was seldom needed. Certainly, he had never faded. He was thin and tough still, but the thing was eating his mind, of course. And the torment had become almost unbearable. All the great secrets under the mountains had turned out to be just an empty night. There was nothing more to find out, nothing worth doing, only nasty, furtive eating and resentful remembering. He was altogether wretched. He hated the dark, and he hated the light more. He hated absolutely everything. And the ring he hated most of all. What do you mean? Said Frodo. Surely the ring was precious, and the only thing he cared for. But if he hated it, why didn't he just simply get rid of it? Or go away and leave it? You ought to begin to understand, Frodo. After all, you've heard, said Gandalf. He hated it, and he loved it. And he hated, and he loved himself. He could not get rid of it. He had no will left in the matter. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, it plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, and that only at an early stage, when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in the history has ever gone beyond playing and really, actually done it. He needed all my help too, and even so, he would have never forsaken it or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decides things. The ring left him. What? Just in time to meet Bilbo. Wouldn't have orc sounded better, or suited better? It is no laughing matter, said Gandalf. Not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time and putting his hand on it plainly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then, when a chance came, it caught poor Daigle, and he was murdered. Poor Deagle, and he was murdered. And after that, Gollum, and it devoured him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, it would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more, and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design, that of the Ringmaker. I could put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you were also meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. It's not, said Frodo, though I'm not sure I understand. But how have you learned all this about the ring and about Gollum? How do you really know it all, or are you still guessing? Gandalf looked at Frodo, and his eyes glinted. I know much, and I have learned much, but I am not going to give an account of all my doings to you. The history of Elendil and Isildur and the One Ring is known to all the wise. Your ring is shown to be that one ring by the fire writing alone, apart from any other needed evidence. And when did you discover that? Asked Frodo, interrupting. Just now, in this room, of course, answered the wizard sharply, but I expected to find it. I've come back from dark journeys and long search to make that final test. It is the last proof, and is now only all too clear. Making out Gollum's part and fitting it in the gap in history required some thought. I may have started with guesses about Gollum, but I am not guessing now. I know I have seen him. Yes, you've seen Gollum. Yes, the obvious thing to do, of course, if I could. I tried long ago, but I have managed it at last. Then what happened after Bilbo escaped from him? Do you know that? Not so clearly. What I have told you is what Gollum is willing to tell, though not, of course, in a way I have reported it. Gollum is a liar, and you have to sift his words. For instance, he called the ring his birthday present, and he stuck to that. He said it came from his grandmother, who had lots of beautiful things of that kind. A simply ridiculous story. I've no doubt that Schmiegel's grandmother was a matriarch, a great person in her way, but to talk of her possessing elven rings was absolutely absurd. And as for giving them away, that is simply nothing but a blatant lie. But a blatant lie with a small grain of truth. The murder of Daigle haunted Gollum, and he made up a defense, repeating to it his precious over and over again as he gnawed bones in the dark, until he almost believed it. It was his birthday. Daigle ought to have given the ring to him. He had previously turned up just so to be a present. It was a birthday present, and so on and so on. I endured as long as I could, but the truth was desperately important, and in the end I had to be harsh. I put the fear of fire in him, and I wrung the true story out of him, bit by bit, together with much sniveling and snarling. He thought he was misunderstood and ill-used. But when he at last told me of his history, as far as the end of the riddle game and Bilbo's escape, he could not say any more except in dark hints some other fear that was greater than mine. He muttered that he was going to get his own back. People would see if he would stand being kicked and, too many pages there, and driven into a hole, and then robbed. Gollum had good friends now, good friends that were very strong. They would help him. Baggins would pay for it. That was his chief thought. He hated Bilbo and cursed his name. What is more, he knew where he came from. But how did he find that out? Asked Frodo. Well, as for the name, Bilbo foolishly told Gollum himself, and after that it would not be difficult to discover his country. Once Gollum came out, yes, he did come out, after longing for the ring proved stronger than his fear of orcs or even of the light. After a year or two, he left the mountains. You see, though still bound by the desire of it, the ring was no longer devouring him. He began to revive. He felt old, terribly old, yet less timid, and he was mortally hungry. Light of sun and moon, he still feared and hated, and he always will, I think. But he was cunning. He found he could hide away from daylight and moonshine, and make his way swiftly and softly by dead of night, with his pale cold eyes, and catch small, frightened, or unwary things. He grew stronger and bolder, with new food and new air. He found his way into Mirkwood, as one would expect. Is that where you found him? Asked Frodo. I saw him there, answered Gandalf, but before that he had wandered far, following Bilbo's trail. It was difficult to learn anything from him for certain, but his talk was constantly interrupted by curses and threats. What had it got in its pockets? He said. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't say, no, precious. Little cheat. Not a fair question. It cheated first, it did. It broke the rules. We ought to have squeezed it, yes, precious, and we will, precious. That is a sample of his talk. I don't suppose you want any more. I had weary days of it, but from hence tromped along the snarls, I even gathered that his padding feet had taken him at last to Esgaroth, and even to the streets of Dale, listening secretly and peering, while the news of the great events went far and wide in Wilderland, and many had heard Bilbo's name and knew where he came from. We made no secret of our return journey from his home in the west. Gollum's sharp ears would soon learn what he wanted. Then why didn't he track Bilbo farther? Why didn't he come to the Shire? Ah, said Gandalf. Now we come to it. I think that Gollum tried to. He set out and he came back westward as far as the Great River. But then he turned aside. He was not daunted by distance, I am sure. Something else drew him away. So my friends think. Those that hunted him for me. The Wood Elves tracked him at first, an easy task, for his trail was still fresh. Through Mirkwood and back again it led them, though they never caught him. The wood was full of rumor of him, dreadful tales, even among beasts and birds. The woodmen said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed trees to find nest, it crept in holes to find the young, it slipped through windows to find cradles. But at the western edge of Mirkwood, the trail turned away. It wandered off south and passed out of the Wood Elf's ken, and it was lost. It was then I made a great mistake. Yes, Frodo, Not the first, though I fear it may be the absolute worst. I let the matter be. I let him go, for I had much else to think of at the time, and I still trusted the lore of Saruman. But that was years ago. I've paid for it since, with many dark and dangerous days. The trail was long cold when I took it up again after Bilbo left here, and my search would have been in vain but for the help that I had from a friend, Aragorn, the greatest traveler and huntsman of this age of the world. Together we sought for Gollum down the whole length of Welderland, without hope and without success. But at last, when I had given up the chase and turned to other parts, Gollum was found. My friend returned out of the great perils, bringing the miserable creature with him. What he had been doing, he would not say. He only wept and called us cruel, that many a Gollum in his throat, and when we pressed him, he whined and cringed, and rubbed his long hands, licking his fingers as if they pained him, as if he remembered some old torture. But I am afraid there is no possible doubt. He had made his slow, sneaking way, stop by stop, mile by mile, south, down at last to the land of Mordor. A heavy silence filled the room. Frodo could hear his heart beating. Even outside, something seemed still. No sound of Sam's shears could now be heard. Yes, to Mordor, said Gandalf. Alas, Mordor draws all wicked things, and the dark power was bending all its will to gather them there. The ring of the enemy would leave its mark too, leave him open to the summons, and all folk were whispering then of the new shadow in the south and its hatred of the west. There were his fine friends who would help him in his revenge. Wretched fool, in that land he would learn much, too much for his comfort, and sooner or later, as he lurked and pried on the borders, he would be caught and taken for examination. That was the way of it, I fear. When he was found, he had already been there very long, and was on his way back, on some errand of mischief. But that does not matter now. His worst mischief was done. Yes, alas, through him the enemy had learned that the One Ring has been found again. He knows where Isildur fell. He knows where Gollum found the ring. And he knows that it is a great ring, for it gave long life. He knows that it is not one of the three, for they have never been lost, and they endure no evil. He knows that it is not one of the 7 or of the 9, for they are all accounted for. He knows that it is the one. He has at last heard, I think, of hobbits and of the Shire. The Shire, he may be seeking it now, if he has not already found out where it lies. Indeed, Frodo, I fear that he may even think that the long unnoticed name of Baggins has become important. But this is terrible, cried Frodo. Far worse than the worst I had imagined from your hints and warnings. Gandalf, what am I to do? For now, I'm really afraid. What am I to do? What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance. Pity. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy to not strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped it in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. I'm sorry, said Frodo. I am just frightened, and I don't feel any pity for Gollum. Have you not seen him? Gandalf broke in. No, and I don't want to, said Frodo. I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc, and just as much as an enemy, he deserves death. Deserves it. I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me he has his part to play, for good or evil, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of the many. Yours, not least. In any case, we did not kill him. He's very old and very wretched. The Wood Elves have him in prison, but they treat him with such kindness as they would have as they can find in their wise hearts. All the same, said Frodo, even if Bilbo could not kill Gollum, I wish he had not kept the ring. I wish he had never found it. I wish I had not got it. Why did you let me keep it? Why didn't you make me throw it away or destroy it? Let you? Make you, said the wizard. Haven't you been listening at all to what I have said? You are not thinking of what you are saying. But as far as throwing it away, that was obviously wrong. These rings have a way of being found. In evil hands, it could be capable of great evil. Worst of all, it might have fallen into the hands of Sauron. Indeed, it certainly would, for this is the one, and he is exerting all of his power to find it and draw it to himself. Of course, my dear Frodo, it is dangerous for you, and that has troubled me deeply. But there was so much at stake, I had to take some risk. Though even I was far away, I've never been. Though even then, I was never further away than a day from the Shire, and have always been its watchful eyes. As long as you never used it, I did not think that the ring would have a lasting effect on you, not for evil, not at any rate for a long time. And you must remember that 9 years ago, when I last saw you, I still knew very little. But why not destroy it, as you say you should have done long ago, cried Frodo. If you warned me, or even sent me a message, I could have done away with it. Would you? And how would you do that? Have you ever tried? Well, no, but I'm sure I could just hammer it or melt it in the fire. Really? Try it. What? Try it. Right now, said Gandalf. Frodo drew the ring out of his pocket again and looked at it. It now appeared plain and smooth, without mark or device that he could see. The gold looked fair and pure. Frodo thought of how rich and beautiful it was in its color, and how perfect it was in its roundness. It was an admirable thing, and altogether precious. When he took it out, he intended to fling it from him into the very hottest part of the fire, but he now found that hand was hesitating. He could not do so, not without great struggle. He weighed the ring, hesitating and forcing himself to remember all that Gandalf had taught him. And then with an effort of will, he made a movement as if to cast it away, but he found that he had put it instead back in his own pocket. Gandalf laughed grimly. You see, already you too, Frodo, cannot easily let it go, nor will to damage it. I could not make you, except by force, which would break your mind. But as for breaking the ring, force is useless. Even if you took it and struck it with the heaviest sledgehammer, it would not even dent. It cannot be unmade by your hands or by mine. Your small fire, of course, would not even melt ordinary gold. This ring has passed through it unscathed and even unheeded. But there's no smith's forge in this shire that would change it at all. Not even the anvils in the furnaces of the dwarves could do anything to it. It has been said that dragon fire could melt and consume the rings of fire, or the rings of power, but there's not any dragon left on earth which the old fire is hot enough. Nor was there any dragon, not even Akalong the Black, could have harmed the One Ring, the ruling ring, for that was made by Sauron himself. There is only one way: to find the cracks of doom in the depths of Origion, the Fire Mountain, and cast the ring there. If you really wish to destroy it, to put it beyond the grasp of the enemy forever. I do really wish to destroy it, cried Frodo. Or, well, to have it destroyed. I am not made for perilous quests. I wish I had never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen? Such questions cannot be answered, said Gandalf. You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess. Not for power or wisdom at any rate. But you have been chosen. You must therefore use your strength and heart and wits that you are granted with. But I have so little of any of those things. You are wise and powerful. Why won't you take the ring, Frodo, thrusting out his hand. No, cried Gandalf, springing to his feet. Without power, I should have power too great and terrible. And over me, the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly. Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity for weakness, and the desire of strength to do good. Please do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe or unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have need of it. Great perils would lie before me. He went to the window, drew the curtains and shutters. Sunlight streamed back in the room. Sam passed along the path whistling. And now, said the wizard, turning back to Frodo, the decision lies with you. But I will always help you. He laid a hand on Frodo's shoulder. I will help you bear this burden, as long as it is yours to bear. But we must do something soon. Sauron is moving. There was a long silence. Gandalf sat down again and puffed at his pipe, as if lost in thought. His eyes seemed closed, but under the lids he was watching Frodo intently. Frodo gazed fixedly on the red embers on the earth until they filled all his vision, and he seemed to be looking down into the profound wells of fire. He was thinking of the fabled cracks of doom and the terror of the fiery mountain. Well, said Gandalf at last, what are you thinking about? Have you decided what to do? No, answered Frodo, coming back to himself out of the darkness, and finding to his surprise that it was not dark at all, but still broad sunlight. Or perhaps, yes, as far as I understand what you have said, I suppose I must keep the ring and guard it, at least for the present, whatever it may do to me. Whatever it may do, it will be slow to evil, but if you keep it with that purpose, said Gandalf. I hope so, said Frodo, but I hope that you may find some other, better keeper soon. But in the meanwhile, it seems that I am a danger to all that live near me. I cannot keep the ring and stay here. I ought to leave Bag End, leave the Shire, leave everything and go away, he sighed. I should like to save the Shire, if I could, though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid, and have felt that an earthquake or an invasion of dragons might actually be good for them. But I don't feel like that now. I feel as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I should know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet can never stand here again. Of course, I have sometimes thought of going away, but I imagined that as a place of a holiday, a series of adventures like Bilbo's or better, ending in peace. But that would mean exile, a flight from danger into danger, drawing it after me. I suppose I must go alone, or if I'm to do that and save the Shire. But I still feel very small, very uprooted, and well desperate. Sauron is strong and terrible. He did not tell Gandalf, but he was speaking of a great desire to follow Bilbo. And perhaps to even find him again. It was so strong it overcame his fear. He could have almost ran out of there down the road without his hat, as Bilbo had done on a similar morning long ago. "My dear Frodo," exclaimed Gandalf, "hobbits truly are amazing creatures, as I have said before. You can learn all there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet after 100 years, they can still surprise you at a pinch." I hardly expected to get such an answer, not even from you. But Bilbo made no mistake in choosing his heir, though the little thought of how important it would prove. I'm afraid you are right. The ring will not be able to stay hidden in the Shire for much longer, and for your sake, as well as the others, you will have to go. Leave the name of Beckons behind you. The name will not be safe to have outside the Shire or in the wild. I will give you a traveling name now. When you go, you will go as Mr. Underhill. But I don't think you need go alone. Not if you know of anyone that you can trust and who would be willing to go by your side, that you would be willing to take on unknown perils. But if you look for a companion, be careful in choosing, and be careful what you say, even to your closest friends. The enemy has spies and many ways of hearing. He suddenly stopped as if listening. Frodo became aware that it was very quiet inside and out. Gandalf crept along the wall to the side of the window. Then with a dart, he sprang to the sill, thrust the long arm out, and downwards there was a squawk, and up came Sam Gamgee's curly head, hauled up by one ear. "Well, well, well, bless my beard," said Gandalf. "Sam Gamgee, is it? Now what may you be doing?" "Lord bless you, Mr. Gandalf, sir," said Sam. "Nothing. Leastways, I was just trimming the grass border under the window. If you follow me." He picked up his shears and exhibited them as evidence. Snip, snip. "I don't," said Gandalf grimly. "It has been some time since I last heard the sound of your shears. How long have you been eavesdropping?" "Eavesdropping, sir? I don't follow you. Begging your pardon. There's no eaves at Back End, and that's a fact." "Don't be a fool. What have you heard, and why did you listen?" Gandalf's eyes flashed. His brows struck out like bristles. "Mr. Frodo, sir," cried Sam, squawking. "Don't let him hurt me, sir. Don't let him turn me into anything unnatural. Me old dad would take on so. I meant no harm, on my honor, sir." "He won't hurt you," said Frodo, hardly able to keep from laughing, although he himself was startled and rather puzzled. "He knows as well as I do that you mean no harm. But just you up and answer his questions right now." "Well, sir," said Sam, dithering a little, I heard a deal that I rightly didn't understand about an enemy and rings and Mr. Bilbo, sir, and dragons and a fiery mountain and the elves. I listened because I couldn't help myself, if you know what I mean. Well, bless me, sir, but I don't love tales of that sort, and I believe them too. Well, whatever Ted may say. Elves, sir, I would dearly love to see them. Couldn't you take me to see the elves, sir, when you go?" Gandalf suddenly laughed. "Come inside," he shouted, and putting through both his arms, he lifted the astonished Sam, shears, grass clippings, and all, right through the window, and stood him on the floor. "Take you to see the elves, eh?" he said, eyeing Sam closely, with the smile flickering on his face. "So you heard that Mr. Frodo was going away?" "I did, sir, and that's why I choked, which you heard, seemingly. I tried not to, sir, but it burst out of me. I was simply so upset." "It can't be helped, Sam," said Frodo sadly. He had suddenly realized that flying from the Shire would mean more painful partings than merely saying farewell to the familiar comforts of Bag End. "I shall have to go, but," he looked hard at Sam, "if you really care about me, you would keep that secret dead. See if you don't. If you even breathe a word of what you may have heard here, then I hope Gandalf will turn you into a spotted toad and fill the garden with grass snakes." Sam fell to his knees, trembling. "Get up, Sam. I have thoughts of something better for you. Something to shut your mouth, and to punish you for listening. You shall go with Mr. Frodo." "Me, sir," cried Sam, springing up like a dog invited to go on a walk. "Me go and see the elves and all. Hooray!" he shouted.